Good afternoon, everybody. In this session, we're going to be talking about RedCap's eConsent framework, and this is very much just a basic introduction to the particular functionality, the particular feature in RedCap. In part, sort of walking through some of the documentation that you're going to find in RedCap itself. So, if you miss something today, or something is a little unclear, that's all going to be accessible to you. RedCap is pretty good in general about having documentation accessible to you for a lot of features within the RedCap project itself. And then, of course, in the help and FAQ, there's a lot more there too. But hopefully this will be helpful, especially for some of you who haven't used it at all before, and where this might be entirely new to you, and you can see a little bit of what it can do. And we'll just jump right in. So here's a basic agenda. These don't break down really evenly, but what is eConsent, first of all, and then introducing the actual features, eConsent framework and PDF auto archiver. And then finally talking about the design and setup using that framework. Probably the second section is going to be the most significant for most of you. And just as a note, please do let me know whether you're in Zoom or in person. Let us know if you're having any audio issues, if I need to lean closer or anything like that, or lean further back. So what is eConsent? And it's likely that many of you are already familiar with what eConsent is. So it's getting informed consent, but doing it digitally. And so you're able to not only are you able to do that digitally rather than just the traditional paper form, but that also means that you're able to do data collection either on site, but it could also be remotely. So it can be at somebody's at home and you're somewhere else. So there are obvious advantages there. So RedCap's eConsent framework is a framework that allows you to perform eConsents within RedCap. And this can be used to obtain electronic signatures for non-FDA regulated studies. IU RedCap is not currently validated for Title 21 CFR Part 11 compliance. And so I want to, before we go any further, add a little asterisk to this statement. So the eConsent framework for IU RedCap can be used to obtain electronic signatures only for non-FDA regulated studies. RedCap itself is capable of being part of a 21 CFR Part 11 validated system, and so it's perfectly possible to use RedCap in studies where it is FDA regulated. It's just IU RedCap has not been through that validation process. And of course, even if and when IU RedCap goes through that process, of course, there's still also regulations. There's still procedures that a given study is going to have to go through on their end. Researchers are going to have to handle to make that study actually validated for that compliance. So even if the system has some validation. And I just wanted to add also that this has been a sort of on and off discussion that's been ongoing about getting IU RedCap validated for 21 CFR Part 11. And the current word on that is that there is an intention still of going through the validation process, but there's no official timeline on that yet. But of course, all the IU RedCap users will find out, will hear from us whenever there's some concrete progress on that front. So consent forms can be implemented in a RedCap survey via computer, mobile phone, or tablet. So all of the usual devices that you would use for any other type of RedCap data collection. And we just want to highlight here that, of course, despite the fact that I've just said that you can use the eConsent framework for consenting, you can use RedCap for collecting electronic signatures, et cetera. Of course, you'll always want to note that and potentially discuss that with IRB in terms of your particular study. So basically, the auto archiver and the eConsent framework option, this feature is going to add two things, which are mentioned in the title. So the first thing is the eConsent framework, properly so called. And so that's going to add an extra certification page so that once a participant completes whatever information you've set up in the survey, once they've filled out the eConsent survey form itself, they're going to click to go to the next page. And the very last page, if you're using the eConsent framework, is instead going to be a certification page that has an inline PDF that's going to be displayed inline, and the participant will be able to see all of their responses, and they're going to check that for accuracy. So they're able to scroll down, scroll through that, check and see exactly what's going to be stored in the database in terms of their what they've entered. And then there's going to be a checkbox, and I'll show you a screenshot later on of what this looks like, but there's going to be a checkbox where they say, I certify that all of this information is accurate and correct. And then the survey, only at that point will they be able to submit the survey once they've checked that box. In fact, if they don't check that box, there's no way for them to submit the survey. So that's the eConsent framework process. But then the second part of this is this PDF auto archiver. So this is connected with the eConsent framework, but in fact, it is possible, I just note this in passing, it's possible that even if you're not using the eConsent framework, you can still enable the PDF auto archiver feature. So that is independent of the eConsent framework feature. So you could use that for any number of reasons that you want to have a static copy of their responses saved in the form of a consent-specific PDF. And so when they complete the consent form, that's going to be stored immediately in the project's file repository. And in the past, it was just stored in the main area of the file repository, but now, in fact, there's a designated folder for these responses. And so the consent-specific PDF will have the values which were entered into the eConsent framework options and survey settings. They'll have those values inserted at the bottom of each page in the PDF, and we'll get to what those values are. A couple of them are listed here, name and date of birth, and we'll talk about some others. So what makes it a framework? Why is it a framework? eConsent framework is referred to as a framework because enabling this option alone doesn't provide an eConsent process, but just gives the general framework or mechanism to allow you to provide eConsent. Of course, as the person creating the survey and administering it, you still have to create the survey and you have to create the questions, including these questions about name, date of birth, and how you want to capture the signature. The framework allows you to implement the process by providing these two tools that we've just talked about, while still providing the ability for you to customize the survey as you like. So the signature process to collect electronic signatures in RedCap, basically there's two ways of doing this. Either you can have someone type their name into a text field, or you can utilize RedCap's signature field type, which will allow them to do a kind of digital signature, wet signature on the survey. You can also assign PIN numbers. You can also combine both of those. So you could have a text field that they type their name into, and then also have a signature field. And so the signature process is not implemented by RedCap automatically. So you will want to construct the survey using one of those methods in order to get that signature captured. So we'll talk about version and type. Versioning, if you're familiar with consenting as a process, then you'll be familiar with versioning. But the idea is, as you go through and you're collecting data with one version of a form, if you then need to make any updates or any changes to that form, you then need to be able to identify as you go along which version of a form someone is using for the consent. And so the eConsent framework facilitates that. It has a space where you're able to enter the version number. So when you're setting it up, you're going to enter the version 1. And then as you go along, you start collecting collecting consents from participants. And then at a certain point, let's say you need to change a question, you need to add something, then you're able to go back into the survey settings, back to the eConsent framework section, and you'll be able to change that version to version 2. And once you save those changes in the survey settings, now anyone who submits a consent from that point forward, it's then going to display on their form as version 2 or version 3, etc. So you'll be able to keep updating that. And that will be reflected as with this optional type field. Those will again be reflected on the footer of the PDF that gets saved of their consent. So type is optional. It's a free-form text field. It's just a text label where you might want to display in the footer something like pediatric or some other type of the survey. And that's especially useful if you have different consent forms within a project for different people, different types of participants, different categories. So eConsent design and setup using the framework. So setting up the eConsent in RedCap, and this is not all of this is about the eConsent framework itself. It's more general. On the project setup page, you're of course going to need to enable the use of surveys in the project. That's one of the very first main project settings that you're looking at when you start your RedCap project. And then in Designer, you're going to need to build your form or forms that you want to use for eConsent. And you'll want to think about including a first and last name fields. It is possible to use the eConsent framework with just a single name field, first and last name together. That's typically not recommended for data quality purposes. But and then a signature field or fields and a date of birth field if you want. And then you would enable the eConsent form as a survey. This is again in Designer or Online Designer. And then in the consent forms survey settings, select the auto archiver and eConsent framework option, and then you'll save changes in survey settings. And so we'll look here at what this looks like in survey settings. So this is a screenshot that hopefully is, most of it at least is fairly legible. Probably more for the people on Zoom. So that's where you're going to select this setting. So it's either disabled by default or auto archiver, or you've got the auto archiver and the eConsent framework. And you can see where I've entered in some of the values, given it a version. I'm not sure what 2.5 would correspond to, but note the several optional settings in the eConsent framework setup. So you have allow eConsent responses to be edited by users. That's something you'll want to think about. Of course, you'll want to think about whether to include certain optional fields like type or date of birth. And then you're able to select up to 5 signature fields. And there's this option about, do you want to force the signature fields to be erased if the participant clicks the previous page button while on the certification page? Or do you want to make sure that they're not able to go back and edit that? And so this is just a picture of what this looks like if you've got the consent form and someone has entered some values into it. And then this is the certification page. So you can see at the bottom where there's the checkbox for I certify all of the information in the above document is correct. And then there will be a submit button at the very bottom of that page. So I've left some time for questions. And so anyone on Zoom or in person, please let me know if you have any questions about this. Yes, Angela. All right. Mm-hmm. So for those of you on Zoom, because we currently don't have it set up where you're able to hear the in-person audience's questions. So Angela's question, if I understood it correctly, is if you've set up the project, you've set up the forms, and you've started. So have you collected any data yet? All right. So this is just about the forms themselves. So you've set up the forms, and you've enabled it as a survey, but you haven't yet set it up. You haven't selected the eConsent framework to do that. And so is that still all right, or is it going to affect any of the questions, any of the forms? So the answer would be no. You're able to go in there at any time and enable the eConsent framework. And in fact, even if you've started collecting data, so let's say you started out with a process where you were doing some paper collection, and then you were going as a kind of backup and entering that data manually into RedCap after you had collected it as a paper form, could you then at some point say, I want to start using the eConsent framework? And yes, you would be able to do that. It wouldn't affect your existing data. You wouldn't be able to do it retroactively. So of course, if you've already collected data, whether by survey or internal data entry, if you've already collected that data, there isn't really a way to apply the certification page process or get that auto-archived PDF retroactively. You can always download PDFs of the saved forms. You can always download PDFs of the completed forms and then store that along with the new PDF auto-archived consents in the file repository. So you can put them all together, organize them. But yes, you're still able to add eConsent framework at any point in the process. Yes. Right, that's a good question. So the question was about if you also need to do an assent, or you're doing assent only for some group of the participants, and not everyone. And so yes, you could do that on a different consent page and have a different type listed for that. And so just have your workflow set up such with a survey queue or something like that, where people are accessing the correct consent form for their particular group or category. And then or you could use branching logic, for example, maybe, so that right. Are there any questions on Zoom or any other questions? What is our timing with that? I think officially till 2:05 they said, but then the break is listed as being from 2 o'clock. So I'm happy to. I will hang around, and please feel free to ask any RedCap questions. I'm Alexander Valenzuela, by the way. I'm the sort of point person for most of the support, education, training for IU RedCap. So some of you, I'm sure, I've corresponded with over the years. So any RedCap questions, anything else, any comments about IU RedCap Day, feel free to talk about. But otherwise, you're free to go in 1 minute. You have to stay for one more minute. But after that, you've got a break.